Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if shadows danced through gaslit streets, where brilliant minds pursued mysteries that whispered of ancient hungers, in a fog-wrapped city where reason met the unexplainable? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. In the autumn of 1888, when London's fog rolled thick as velvet curtains across cobblestone streets, the city breathed with a rhythm all its own. The gentle hiss of gas lamps painted amber pools of warmth against the encroaching darkness, while somewhere in the distance church bells chimed the hour with voices as soft as lullabies. The Thames whispered its ancient songs against weathered stones, carrying tales from centuries past, while overhead chimney smoke curled into the night sky like incense from some forgotten ritual. Baker Street held its own particular magic during these twilight hours. The familiar weight of Victorian life settled over its residents like a comfortable blanket. The clip-clop of horse hooves on stone, the distant murmur of conversations drifting from behind lace curtains, the warm glow emanating from windows where families gathered around hearth fires. It was in this cocoon of everyday wonder that extraordinary minds contemplated mysteries that danced just beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. The flat at 221B bore witness to countless such contemplations. Tonight, as autumn rain began its gentle percussion against window panes, the rooms held an air of expectancy. The sitting room, with its deep leather chairs worn smooth by years of thoughtful occupation, seemed to pulse with an energy that spoke of intellectual pursuit. Books lined every surface, their leather spines creating a tapestry of knowledge that stretched from floor to ceiling. The fireplace crackled with a warmth that reached beyond mere temperature, offering comfort to both body and spirit. Sherlock Holmes stood at the window, his tall, lean silhouette etched against the amber glow of the street lamps below. His sharp features were softened by the diffused light, his grey eyes reflecting depth that seemed to hold entire universes of observation and deduction. The detective's long fingers, stained faintly with chemicals from his experiments, traced patterns on the glass as he watched the fog swirl through the narrow streets like living smoke. There was something almost meditative in his stillness, a quality that spoke of a mind processing information with the precision of a finely crafted timepiece. The gentle sound of footsteps on the stairs preceded the arrival of Dr. John Watson, whose steady presence had become as much a part of the flat's atmosphere as the scent of pipe tobacco and chemical solutions. Watson moved with the measured gait of a man who had seen both war and peace, his weathered hands carrying the evening's post and a steaming cup of tea that sent ribbons of steam into the warm air. His face bore the comfortable lines of middle age, and his eyes held the kind of compassion that came from understanding human nature in all its complexity. "The evening brings interesting correspondence," Watson said, his voice carrying the soothing cadence of a man accustomed to bringing calm to chaos. He settled into his familiar chair, the leather sighing gently under his weight, and spread the letters across the small table that had witnessed countless such evenings. "Inspector Lestrade has sent word of most peculiar circumstances in Whitechapel." Holmes turned from the window with the fluid grace of a dancer, his attention shifting like the focus of a telescope brought suddenly into perfect alignment. The detective's movements held an economy of motion that spoke of a mind that wasted neither thought nor gesture, each action purposeful and precise. He approached the table with steps that seemed to float across the Persian carpet, his dark coat trailing behind him like the wings of some great, thoughtful bird. "Peculiar how?" Holmes inquired, settling into his chair with the same careful attention he brought to every aspect of his existence. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility, and tinged with the kind of curiosity that had driven explorers to map unknown territories and scholars to unlock ancient mysteries. Watson lifted the letter, the paper crackling softly in the warm air. 3 deaths in as many nights, each following a pattern that defies conventional explanation. The victims, drained of blood, Holmes, Not merely injured or stabbed, but drained. As if ... He paused, searching for words that might make sense of the senseless. The detective's fingers steepled before his face, creating a cathedral of thought that seemed to focus his considerable mental energies. His grey eyes took on the distant quality of a man seeing beyond the immediate present, processing information through the complex algorithms of deduction that had made his reputation. The firelight played across his features, casting shadows that danced and shifted like the very mysteries he pursued. As if something had drawn the very essence of life from them, Holmes finished, his voice carrying neither skepticism nor belief, but rather the neutral tone of a scientist observing a phenomenon yet to be understood. Tell me, Watson, what does our good inspector make of these circumstances? The doctor's expression grew thoughtful, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered his response. He speaks in whispers of superstition, of fears that run deeper than mere criminal activity. The people of Whitechapel are frightened, Holmes, not merely concerned or cautious, but frightened in a way that reaches back to childhood fears of things that move in darkness. Outside, the rain continued its gentle symphony against the windows, each drop adding its voice to a chorus that had sung London to sleep for centuries. The fog pressed against the glass like curious spirits seeking entry, swirling in patterns that seemed almost purposeful in their movement. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across rooftops and chimney pots to mark the passage of time in a city where past and present existed in constant dialogue. Holmes rose from his chair with the sudden energy of a predator catching scent of quarry, but his movements remained controlled, graceful, like those of a conductor preparing to guide an orchestra through a complex symphony. He moved to his desk, where papers and instruments lay arranged with the precision of a surgeon's tools, each item placed exactly where instinct and habit demanded. "Watson," he said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of discovery, "what do you know of the old legends, the stories that grandmothers tell children to keep them safe in their beds after dark?" The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly, creating furrows in his forehead that spoke of a lifetime of expressions ranging from surprise to deep concern. "You speak of vampires, Holmes, creatures of folklore and Gothic romance, surely not." "Not subjects for scientific inquiry," Holmes interrupted gently, his tone holding neither mockery nor dismissal, but rather the patient voice of a teacher guiding a student toward understanding. "And yet, here we have deaths that follow patterns established in legend, in stories told around fires when the world was young and mysterious. Perhaps our scientific age has been too hasty in dismissing what previous generations accepted as truth." The detective moved to his bookshelf, his fingers dancing along leather spines with the familiarity of a pianist finding familiar keys. He selected a volume bound in deep burgundy leather, its cover worn smooth by handling, and opened it to pages that seemed to whisper with age. The book fell open naturally to passages that had been consulted before, marked with careful annotations in Holmes's distinctive hand. "Listen to this," he said, settling back into his chair with the book cradled in his lap like a treasured child. His voice took on the cadence of scholarly recitation, each word chosen and weighted with significance. From Montague Summers's treatise on supernatural manifestations, the vampire, as understood by the peoples of Eastern Europe, is not merely a creature of imagination, but a documented phenomenon that has troubled human communities for millennia. The characteristics remain consistent across cultures and centuries: the draining of blood, the marks upon the throat, the unnatural preservation of the body after death. Watson leaned forward in his chair, drawn by the hypnotic quality of his friend's voice and the implications of the words being spoken. The firelight caught the silver in his hair, transforming it into threads of precious metal that seemed to glow with their own inner light. His hands, steady from years of medical practice and steady from years of friendship with Holmes, clasped together as he absorbed the implications of what was being suggested. "You truly believe we may be dealing with such creatures?" Watson asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man walking on unstable ground. "In London, in our modern age of gas lights and telegraph wires. Holmes closed the book with a soft whisper of pages, his grey eyes meeting Watson's with an intensity that seemed to bridge the space between them. "I believe, my dear friend, that we are dealing with something that operates outside the boundaries of what we consider normal criminal behaviour. Whether we call it vampire or simply unknown, the pattern demands investigation." The detective rose and moved again to the window, where the fog had thickened to the consistency of cotton wool soaked in amber light. The street lamps created islands of illumination in an ocean of grey mist, each pool of light offering refuge from the encroaching darkness. In the distance, the sounds of London's nightlife continued their eternal symphony. The clip-clop of horses, the distant laughter from public houses, the soft whisper of wind through narrow alleys, where shadows held secrets older than memory. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, his voice carrying across the room like a promise, "we shall visit Whitechapel. We shall walk where these deaths occurred, speak with those who witnessed the aftermath, and perhaps discover whether the old legends have found new expression in our modern world." Watson nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. He had followed Holmes into mysteries before, but this felt different somehow, deeper, older, touched with implications that reached beyond mere criminal investigation into realms where reason met the inexplicable. The doctor settled back in his chair, allowing the warmth of the fire to seep into his bones while outside. London breathed its ancient rhythms, and somewhere in Whitechapel, shadows gathered with hungry intent. The night deepened around Baker Street, wrapping the flat in layers of comfortable darkness punctuated by the gentle glow of gas flames. The rain continued its percussion against the windows, each drop adding its voice to a lullaby that had sung the city to sleep for generations. In the sitting room, two men prepared to pursue a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they understood about the world, while outside, fog and shadow conspired to hide secrets that had waited centuries for discovery. As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight with bronze-voiced authority, Holmes and Watson remained in their chairs, each lost in contemplation of what tomorrow might bring. The fire crackled its ancient song of warmth and safety, while beyond the windows, London settled into the deep rhythms of night, unaware that somewhere in its darkest corners, legends walked with the measured steps of terrible purpose. The following morning arrived with the gentle persistence of autumn light, filtering through lace curtains, transforming the sitting room into a cathedral of amber and gold. The fire had settled into glowing embers that pulsed like a heartbeat in the hearth, while outside the fog of the previous evening had lifted to reveal a London washed clean by rain and painted fresh with morning light. The familiar sounds of the city awakening drifted through the windows, milk carts rattling over cobblestones, the distant calls of vendors beginning their daily rounds, the soft whisper of coal smoke rising from countless chimneys. Holmes had been awake before dawn, moving through his morning routine with the precision of ritual. His tall frame was impeccably dressed in his customary dark coat and trousers, every detail attended to with the same meticulous care he brought to his investigations. Watson found him at the breakfast table, where Mrs. Hudson had arranged their meal with the loving attention of a mother caring for beloved children. Warm bread that released clouds of steam when broken, preserves that gleamed like jewels in crystal jars, tea that sent spirals of aromatic vapour into the morning air. "You've been reading," Watson observed, noting the collection of books and newspapers spread across the table like evidence in a case. The doctor settled into his chair with the comfortable movements of long habit, his presence bringing a sense of balance to the scene. His weathered hands reached for the teapot with movements worn smooth by countless such mornings, creating patterns of domesticity that contrasted sharply with the exotic nature of their intended investigation. "Research," Holmes corrected gently, his fingers tracing lines of text with the delicate touch of a scholar handling precious manuscripts. "The newspapers speak in whispers of the Whitechapel deaths, but between the lines one can read volumes about public sentiment. Fear, Watson. Fear that goes deeper than concern about criminal activity. The people sense something ancient stirring in their midst. The detective lifted a paper dated 3 days previous, its headlines speaking of ordinary concerns, trade disputes, political manoeuvrings, social events that comprised the daily fabric of London life. But tucked away in smaller print, almost hidden among advertisements for patent medicines and notices of theatrical performances, were brief mentions of the mysterious deaths that had begun to trouble Whitechapel's residents. Here, Holmes said, his voice taking on the rhythm of discovery, Mary Elizabeth Nichols, age 43, found deceased in Bucks Row with injuries that local physicians describe as unprecedented in their nature. And here, Annie Chapman, discovered in Hanbury Street, bearing wounds that suggest the work of someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The pattern is there, Watson, hidden in plain sight beneath the conventional language of journalism. Watson accepted a cup of tea from Holmes's steady hands, the warmth of the china seeping through his fingers like a promise of comfort in an increasingly complex world. He had learned to trust his friend's ability to see patterns where others saw only random events, to perceive connections that escaped ordinary observation. This morning felt different, though, charged with anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. "The third victim?" Watson inquired, settling back in his chair as autumn sunlight painted geometric patterns across the breakfast table. The light held the particular quality of London mornings, filtered through countless layers of atmosphere to create an illumination that was both warm and mysterious, like viewing the world through amber glass. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful, his grey eyes focusing on something beyond the immediate present. Elizabeth Stride found in Berner Street, but her case presents interesting variations from the pattern. The wounds were incomplete, as if the perpetrator had been interrupted in the midst of his work. The detective paused, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm against the table, or perhaps as if something had frightened away even a creature of the night. The implication hung between them like incense, creating an atmosphere thick with possibility and tinged with the kind of anticipation that preceded great discoveries. Watson felt the familiar stirring of excitement that came with the beginning of their investigations, but this time it was tempered with something deeper, a sense that they were approaching territory where conventional understanding might prove insufficient. After breakfast, they prepared for their journey into Whitechapel, with a thoroughness that Holmes brought to every undertaking. The detective's travelling coat was arranged with military precision, its pockets containing instruments of observation and deduction that had served them well in countless previous cases. Watson checked his medical bag with practised efficiency, ensuring that his instruments were clean and ready, though he harboured the uncomfortable suspicion that conventional medicine might prove inadequate to the challenges they would face. The hansom cab that carried them through London's awakening streets moved with the steady rhythm of iron wheels on stone, creating a percussion that seemed to match the beating of their hearts. Outside the windows, the city revealed itself in layers, the respectable facades of middle-class neighbourhoods giving way gradually to areas where poverty and desperation had left their marks on both architecture and inhabitants. The change was subtle at first, noticed in the gradual deterioration of building maintenance, the increasing frequency of boarded windows, the way pedestrians moved with the cautious alertness of those accustomed to navigating dangerous territory. As they approached Whitechapel, the very air seemed to change, taking on qualities that spoke of lives lived at the margins of society. The fog that had lifted from more prosperous areas of London still clung to these narrow streets like a reluctant spirit, creating pockets of mystery where shadows moved with purposes unknown. The buildings pressed close together as if seeking mutual support against forces too powerful to face alone, their brick faces stained with decades of coal smoke and industrial grime. The cab deposited them at the edge of Bucks Row, where the first of the mysterious deaths had occurred. The street stretched before them like a canyon carved from brick and mortar, its cobblestones worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, carrying the burdens of hard lives. Gas lamps stood at irregular intervals like sentinels, their globes clouded with the residue of burning coal gas, creating pools of wavering light that seemed to pulse with organic rhythm. Holmes stepped from the cab with movements that seemed to gather information from the very air around him. His sharp eyes moved in systematic patterns, cataloguing details that would escape ordinary observation: the pattern of wear on the cobblestones, the distribution of debris in the gutters, the way morning light fell across building faces to create maps of shadow and illumination. Watson followed with the steady tread of a man accustomed to supporting his friend's investigative process, his medical training providing its own perspective on the scene that would unfold before them. The location where Mary Elizabeth Nichols had been discovered lay in a narrow passage between two towering tenements, their brick walls rising like cliffs on either side of a space barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably. The morning light penetrated this canyon only briefly, creating a twilight atmosphere that seemed perpetual and somehow intentional, as if the very architecture conspired to maintain an environment where mysterious events might unfold unobserved. Holmes knelt at the spot where the body had been found, his long fingers hovering just above the cobblestones, as if he could absorb information through proximity alone. His grey eyes took on the distant quality of deep concentration, processing details visible and invisible with the precision of scientific instruments. Watson stood nearby, his presence providing both support and perspective as they began their investigation into mysteries that challenged the boundaries of rational explanation. "The position of the body," Holmes murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "suggests she was not killed here, but rather arranged with deliberate care. See how the cobblestones are clean in this precise outline, as if someone had taken great pains to ensure no trace of the actual crime remained." His fingers traced patterns in the air above the stones, mapping invisible evidence with the skill of a cartographer charting unknown territories. Watson crouched beside his friend, bringing his medical training to bear on the reconstruction of events. "The wounds described in the police report," he said thoughtfully, "they would have required considerable time to inflict. Yet no sounds were heard, no disturbance reported by the residents of these buildings. How does one account for such silence in a neighbourhood where privacy is a luxury few can afford?" The detective rose slowly, his tall frame unfolding like a telescope extending to its full length. His gaze swept the surrounding area with the methodical precision of a surveyor, noting details that might prove significant: windows that offered views of the passage, doorways that might provide concealment, the complex geography of shadows that could hide movement even in broad daylight. Every surface seemed to hold potential clues, every angle offered possibilities for understanding the impossible. "Perhaps," Holmes said, his voice carrying the weight of the growing certainty, "silence was not a factor to be overcome, but rather a tool employed with expert precision. What if our perpetrator possessed abilities that rendered struggle unnecessary, resistance impossible? They moved through Whitechapel like scholars exploring an ancient text, each street revealing new layers of meaning, each intersection offering perspectives that deepened their understanding of the mystery they faced. The residents they encountered moved with the wary alertness of prey animals, their eyes holding depths of fear that spoke of knowledge too dangerous to share openly. Conversations were brief and conducted in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might attract attention from forces better left undisturbed. At Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman had met her mysterious end, the pattern repeated with variations that spoke of a mind both methodical and adaptable. The scene bore the same careful arrangement, the same absence of physical evidence, the same impossible silence that had characterized the first death. But here, Holmes detected subtle differences, traces of disturbance that suggested the perpetrator had spent more time at his work and had perhaps been more thorough in his mysterious purposes. "The precision," Watson observed, kneeling to examine scratches in the cobblestones that might have been made by something sharper than ordinary tools, "suggests not merely criminal intent, but rather the working of someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy. These are not random wounds, Holmes, but carefully placed incisions designed to achieve specific results." Holmes nodded slowly, his grey eyes reflecting the kind of understanding that came from seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. "And yet the precision extends beyond mere anatomical knowledge, Watson. Consider the positioning of the bodies, the selection of locations, the timing of the discoveries. We are dealing with a mind that thinks in terms of theatre as much as biology, staging as much as substance. The afternoon wore on with the gradual intensity of a symphony building toward crescendo, each location they visited adding new instruments to the orchestra of mystery that surrounded them. At Burner Street, where Elizabeth Stride had been found, the pattern showed its first significant variation, evidence of interruption, signs that the perpetrator's work had been halted before completion. Holmes studied these deviations with the focused attention of a musician analysing a composition, seeking to understand not merely what had happened, but why it had been prevented from reaching its intended conclusion. Something interrupted the process here, Holmes said, his voice carrying the certainty of deduction backed by evidence. But what could frighten away a creature confident enough to operate in the very heart of London's most dangerous district? What force exists that even our mysterious perpetrator must acknowledge? As evening approached with the gentle inevitability of tide, they found themselves in the 10 Bells public house, where the warm glow of gas lamps created islands of comfort in an ocean of gathering darkness. The establishment buzzed with conversation conducted in the careful undertones of people discussing matters too sensitive for open discourse. Holmes and Watson settled at a table in a corner where shadows provided both concealment and opportunity for observation. Their presence noted but accepted by patrons accustomed to strangers seeking information in exchange for coins. The barkeep, a man whose weathered face spoke of years spent navigating the complex currents of Whitechapel society, approached their table with the cautious courtesy of someone accustomed to evaluating the potential danger posed by customers. His movements were economical and practical, designed to convey neither civility nor challenge, but rather the neutral professionalism of someone who had learned to survive by remaining useful without becoming threatening. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the particular accent of London's working class, refined by years of interaction with customers from every level of society. "What brings you to our corner of the city on such an evening? Not the usual sort we see in these parts, if you don't mind my observation." Holmes smiled with the warmth that had won him confidences in drawing rooms and jail cells alike, his manner suggesting both authority and approachability. "We're investigating the recent unfortunate events," he said, his voice carrying just enough official implication to suggest police connection without claiming specific authority. "The residents of this area have suffered greatly, and we hope to provide some measure of understanding, if not relief." The barkeep's expression grew thoughtful, his eyes holding the particular wariness of someone who had learned to measure words carefully before speaking. Around them, conversation continued in murmurs punctuated by the soft clink of glasses and the gentle hiss of gas flames, creating an atmosphere that seemed designed for the sharing of secrets. The public house held the accumulated wisdom of countless evenings spent in discussion of neighbourhood affairs, its walls seeming to pulse with the collective knowledge of a community that had learned to protect itself through careful information sharing. "Terrible business," the barkeep said finally, his voice dropping to match the conspiratorial tone that had become standard for such discussions. "But not the sort of terrible business we're accustomed to, if you take my meaning. This has a different quality to it, something that reaches back to fears we thought we'd left behind in darker times." Watson leaned forward slightly, his medical training providing insight into the physical manifestations of fear and stress that marked the man's demeanour. "You speak as if the residents suspect more than ordinary criminal activity," he observed gently. "What sort of fears are we discussing?" The barkeep glanced around the room with the automatic caution of someone accustomed to monitoring his environment for signs of danger. The other patrons continued their quiet conversations, but there was an undercurrent of attention that suggested every ear in the room was tuned to their discussion. In Whitechapel, information was a commodity as valuable as coin and potentially far more dangerous. "Old fears," the man said quietly, his voice barely audible above the general murmur of the room. "The kind our grandmothers spoke of when they wanted to keep children from wandering after dark. Tales of things that walked between worlds, that fed on more than ordinary sustenance. We thought such stories were just that, stories. But now—" He gestured vaguely toward the door, beyond which the streets of Whitechapel lay shrouded in gathering twilight. Now people see shadows that move with purpose, hear sounds that don't match any earthly creature. 3 women dead in ways that defy explanation, and the whole neighbourhood holding its breath, waiting to see what darkness might claim next. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Watson, communication passing between them with the efficiency of long partnership. They had encountered fear before in their investigations, but this carried qualities that set it apart from ordinary criminal concern. This was fear rooted in something deeper, older, connected to instincts that predated civilized understanding of how the world operated. These shadows, Holmes said carefully, have they been observed directly, or are we speaking of impressions and rumours? The barkeep's expression grew even more cautious, his eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that he seemed reluctant to share. Mary Kelly saw something the night before the first murder, he said finally, his words chosen with the precision of a man walking through a minefield. Came in here shaking like a leaf, talking about a figure that seemed to float rather than walk, moving without making sound on cobblestones that announce every footstep. He paused, seeming to wrestle with the decision of how much to reveal. Said it looked at her with eyes that glowed like coals in the darkness, and she felt something trying to pull at her very soul. Nonsense, of course. The ravings of a woman who'd had too much gin. But Mary Kelly's not given to fancies, gentlemen. She's seen enough real horror in her life to know the difference between imagination and truth. Watson's medical training led him to consider the physiological aspects of such an encounter. The symptoms you describe, shaking, disorientation, the sense of spiritual violation, they're consistent with extreme psychological trauma. But what could cause such a reaction in someone accustomed to the dangers of Whitechapel? That's the question that keeps us all awake at night, the barkeep replied, his voice carrying the weight of community anxiety. What exists in our familiar streets that can reduce a strong woman to a trembling wreck with nothing more than a look? What walks among us wearing shapes that our minds can't quite process, leaving traces that challenge everything we think we understand about the nature of reality? As the evening deepened around the 10 bells, Holmes and Watson gathered information with the patience of archaeologists excavating ancient ruins. Each conversation revealed new layers of mystery, each testimony adding pieces to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex rather than clearer with each addition. The residents of Whitechapel possessed a collective wisdom born of survival in London's most challenging environment, but even their hard-won knowledge seemed inadequate to explain the phenomena that had begun to plague their community. The fog had begun to roll in from the Thames as they finally emerged from the public house, its tendrils creeping through narrow streets like curious fingers exploring unfamiliar territory. Gas lamps created islands of illumination in the gathering mist, each pool of light offering temporary refuge from the encroaching darkness. The sounds of evening Whitechapel echoed off brick walls and cobblestone streets. Distant laughter from public houses, the clip-clop of horses pulling late carriages, the soft whisper of wind carrying scents of coal smoke and human habitation. The pattern is clear, Holmes said as they walked through streets that seemed to pulse with hidden life. His voice carried the confidence of understanding, backed by systematic observation, but it was tempered with recognition of the challenges that lay ahead. We are dealing with something that operates outside conventional criminal behaviour, something that possesses abilities that challenge our understanding of what is possible within the natural world. Watson nodded thoughtfully, his medical bag swinging gently at his side as they navigated the increasingly treacherous geography of fog-shrouded streets. The question becomes whether we approach this as scientists seeking to understand new phenomena, or as men of action preparing to confront forces that may prove hostile to human welfare. Perhaps, Holmes replied, his tall figure moving through the mist like a ship navigating by instruments rather than sight. The distinction is less important than we might assume. Science and action, understanding and intervention, they are simply different aspects of the same fundamental human response to mystery. We observe, we analyse, we act upon our conclusions. The nature of our adversary may be unusual, but our methods remain constant. They had arranged to spend the night in modest lodgings near the heart of Whitechapel, reasoning that proximity to the scene of the crimes might provide opportunities for observation that would be impossible from the comfortable distance of Baker Street. The boarding house that welcomed them was clean but Spartan, its rooms furnished with the bare necessities required for travellers who valued function over comfort. The proprietor, a woman whose face bore the particular combination of kindness and wariness that characterised successful business operators in challenging neighbourhoods, showed them to adjacent rooms with windows that offered views of the street below. "Keep your windows latched," she advised in the matter-of-fact tone of someone dispensing essential survival information. "And don't be surprised if you hear unusual sounds during the night. These past weeks have brought disturbances that none of us quite understand, but we've learned it's safer not to investigate too closely." Holmes settled at his window as full darkness claimed the streets of Whitechapel. His sharp eyes adapted to the task of observation in conditions that would challenge ordinary vision. The fog had thickened to the consistency of cotton wool, transforming familiar geography into an alien landscape where distances became deceptive and shapes took on qualities that defied easy identification. Gas lamps struggled to penetrate the dense atmosphere, creating halos of light that seemed to float suspended in grey nothingness. Watson arranged himself at his own window with the patience of a soldier accustomed to long watches in hostile territory. His medical bag lay within easy reach, though he harboured doubts about the effectiveness of conventional remedies against whatever forces had been responsible for the mysterious deaths. The boarding house settled around them with the gradual subsidence of a building adjusting to the weight of night, its timber frame creaking gentle songs of age and endurance. The first hours of their vigil passed in relative quiet, marked only by the occasional passage of late pedestrians, whose footsteps echoed off invisible walls with hollow percussion that seemed to emphasise the isolation of those brave enough to venture into Whitechapel's fog-shrouded streets. Holmes maintained his position at the window with the focused attention of a hunter, waiting for the quarry to reveal itself, his grey eyes moving in systematic patterns designed to catch any deviation from the expected rhythm of urban nightlife. It was Watson who first noticed the change in atmospheric pressure that seemed to precede something extraordinary. The quality of silence shifted subtly, taking on characteristics that suggested the presence of forces not bound by ordinary physical laws. The fog began to move in patterns that seemed too purposeful to be explained by natural air currents, swirling in spirals that created brief clearings before closing again like curtains drawn by invisible hands. "Holmes," Watson whispered, his voice barely audible even in the profound quiet that had settled over the street. "Do you see the movement in the fog? There, near the lamppost at the corner." The detective's attention, focused like a telescope, brought suddenly into perfect alignment, his entire being concentrating on the phenomenon his friend had observed. In the swirling mist, shapes seemed to coalesce and dissolve with hypnotic regularity, as if something was testing the boundaries between visibility and concealment. The movements were too fluid to be human, too purposeful to be entirely natural, creating patterns that suggested intelligence operating according to principles that lay outside ordinary understanding. As they watched, a figure began to emerge from the fog with movements that seemed to flow rather than step, gliding across cobblestones with the ease of smoke carried by wind. The shape possessed human characteristics, the general proportions of height and width that marked it as formerly mortal. But there was something in its movement that spoke of transformation beyond death, of existence continued under rules that mortality could not comprehend. The figure paused beneath the gas lamp, and for a moment its features became visible in the amber light. It was unmistakably the form of a man, but a man changed by forces that had sculpted his flesh into something that transcended ordinary human limitations. His face bore the pale perfection of marble sculpture, but his eyes held depths that seemed to reflect eternity itself. When he moved his head to survey the street around him, the motion carried the fluid grace of a predator confident in its dominion over lesser creatures. Watson felt his breath catch in his throat as the figure's gaze swept across the boarding-house windows. For a moment that seemed to stretch into hours, those ancient eyes seemed to focus directly on their observation point, and the doctor experienced a sensation unlike any he had encountered in years of medical practice and military service. It was as if something was reaching into his mind, testing the strength of his will, evaluating him as both obstacle and potential prey. Holmes remained perfectly still beside the window, but Watson could sense the tension radiating from his friend like heat from a forge. The detective's scientific mind was undoubtedly cataloguing every detail of the encounter, filing observations for later analysis, but even his legendary composure seemed strained by direct confrontation with phenomena that challenged the foundations of rational thought. The figure in the street began to move again, his path taking him deeper into the maze of narrow alleys that comprised Whitechapel's secret geography. But his movement was not the random wandering of someone exploring unfamiliar territory. It carried the purposeful direction of a hunter following scent trails invisible to ordinary senses. As he disappeared into the fog, the very atmosphere seemed to exhale, as if the neighbourhood itself had been holding its breath during his passage. "Did you observe the absence of footsteps?" Holmes whispered, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of discovery. The figure moved across cobblestones that announce every human footfall, yet produced no sound whatsoever. We are indeed dealing with something that operates outside the normal parameters of physical existence. Watson nodded slowly, his medical training struggling to process what he'd witnessed. The movements were too fluid for ordinary human locomotion, he agreed, his voice thoughtful. But more disturbing was the sense of intelligence behind those eyes, ancient, calculating, evaluating everything it observed as potential resources or obstacles. They maintained their vigil through the remaining hours of night, but the mysterious figure did not return to their section of Whitechapel. The fog gradually began to thin as dawn approached, revealing familiar street geography that seemed somehow changed by the night's revelations. The gas lamps flickered and dimmed as morning light began its gentle conquest of darkness, transforming the mysterious landscape back into the mundane reality of cobblestones and brick buildings. But the memory of what they had witnessed lingered like the scent of exotic incense, impossible to dismiss or explain within the comfortable boundaries of rational thought. Holmes rose from his position at the window with the careful movements of a man who had spent hours in motionless observation, his tall frame unfolding like a telescope, extending to reveal new perspectives on familiar territory. His grey eyes held the particular intensity that came with the successful gathering of crucial evidence, but they were tempered with recognition of the challenges that such evidence presented. "We have confirmation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of scientific certainty backed by direct observation. "Whatever force has been responsible for the deaths in Whitechapel, it possesses capabilities that place it outside the realm of ordinary criminal investigation. We are dealing with something that exists in the spaces between conventional understanding and ancient knowledge." Watson stretched muscles cramped by hours of vigilant stillness, his medical training automatically assessing the physical toll of their night-long observation. But his mind remained focused on the implications of what they had witnessed. The graceful movements that defied natural law, the eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience beyond human comprehension, the sense of intelligence operating according to principles that mortality could barely grasp. "The question becomes," Watson said thoughtfully, "how does one investigate, much less confront, a force that appears to exist outside the natural order? Our usual methods of evidence gathering and logical deduction may prove inadequate to the task." Holmes moved to his travelling case with the purposeful efficiency that marked all his preparations, selecting instruments and materials with the focused attention of a surgeon preparing for complex surgery. But this morning's preparations included items that would have seemed out of place in conventional detective work. A collection of wooden stakes carved from ancient oak, a vial of water that had been blessed by ecclesiastical authority, a mirror of silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own internal light. "Adaptation," Holmes replied, his voice carrying the confidence of a mind that had never encountered a problem beyond its eventual solution. "We adapt our methods to match the nature of our quarry. If we face supernatural forces, we employ supernatural countermeasures. If ancient knowledge is required, we consult ancient sources. The principles of investigation remain constant, even when the subject matter challenges our preconceptions." The morning brought a London washed clean by night fog and painted fresh with autumn sunlight that seemed to carry promises of clarity and revelation. The streets of Whitechapel bustled with the familiar activities of daily life. Vendors setting up their stalls, workers beginning their journeys to factories and shops, children playing games that transformed mundane alleys into kingdoms of imagination. Yet beneath this surface of normalcy, Holmes and Watson could sense the underlying current of anxiety that had become as much a part of the neighbourhood's atmosphere as the scent of coal smoke and industrial activity. They breakfasted in a small cafe, whose proprietor had learned to cater to customers seeking both sustenance and information. The establishment buzzed with conversation conducted in the careful undertones that had become standard for any discussion of recent events, each table hosting whispered conferences that seemed to pulse with collective concern. Holmes and Watson positioned themselves where they could observe without appearing to eavesdrop, their presence accepted as part of the general acknowledgement that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary attention. "The fog was thicker than usual last night," observed a woman at a nearby table, her voice carrying the particular accent of someone who had spent her entire life in London's working-class neighbourhoods. And the sounds. There were sounds that didn't match anything natural, like whispers in languages that hurt to hear, carried on air that moved against the wind. Her companion nodded with the grim understanding of someone who had experienced similar phenomena. "My grandmother used to tell stories about such nights," she replied, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea as if drawing warmth from more than mere temperature. "Times when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, when things that should remain hidden found ways to walk among the living. I thought they were just tales to frighten children into good behaviour." Holmes listened to these conversations with the focused attention of a scholar studying primary source documents, recognising that the residents of Whitechapel possessed collective wisdom that academic study could never provide. Their knowledge was earned through direct experience with forces that textbooks could only theorise about, making them invaluable resources for understanding the true nature of the mystery he faced. After breakfast, they set out to visit the local ecclesiastical authority, reasoning that if supernatural forces were indeed at work, religious knowledge might provide insights unavailable through purely scientific investigation. The Church of St. Botolph stood at the edge of Whitechapel like a fortress of faith in a landscape increasingly dominated by industrial progress, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of human struggle against forces both earthly and otherworldly. Father Mackenzie received them in a study lined with volumes that seemed to exude wisdom, accumulated over generations of spiritual warfare against darkness in all its forms. The priest was a man whose face bore the particular combination of compassion and determination that marked those who had dedicated their lives to protecting others from threats both seen and unseen. His eyes held depths of knowledge that came from years spent ministering to souls in London's most challenging environment. "You've come about the deaths," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with crises that challenged conventional understanding. "I've been expecting someone like yourselves, men of intelligence and dedication, who might possess the combination of scientific training and open-mindedness necessary to confront what we're facing." Holmes settled into the chair offered with the grace of a man accustomed to extracting information from sources ranging from street criminals to university professors. His grey eyes reflected genuine respect for the priest's knowledge, while maintaining the analytical detachment necessary for effective investigation. "You speak as if you have direct knowledge of the forces involved," he observed. "What has your experience revealed about the nature of our adversary?" Father Mackenzie's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how much to reveal to visitors whose true motivations remained unclear. The study around them seemed to pulse with accumulated wisdom, its walls lined with texts that spoke of humanity's long struggle against forces that existed in the shadows, between faith and reason. Somewhere beyond the windows, London continued its eternal rhythms, but within this sanctuary conversation could turn to matters too dangerous for public discourse. "The old knowledge speaks of creatures that exist in the spaces between life and death," the priest said finally, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned to measure words against their potential consequences. "Beings that once possessed human souls but have been transformed by forces that corrupt the very essence of mortality." They retain intelligence, even cunning, but they are driven by hunger that can never be satisfied through ordinary means. Watson leaned forward in his chair, his medical training providing perspective on the physiological implications of such transformation. "You speak of vampires," he said directly, using the term that had been whispered, but never openly acknowledged. "Creatures of legend and folklore, but you discuss them as if they represent documented reality rather than mere superstition. Documentation exists for those willing to look beyond conventional academic sources," Father Mackenzie replied, moving to his bookshelf with movements that seemed guided by long familiarity with its contents. He selected a volume bound in leather so old it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its pages yellow with age and marked with annotations in multiple languages. The Church has maintained records of such encounters for centuries, not as curiosities or folklore, but as practical knowledge necessary for protecting human souls from predation. He opened the book to pages that seemed to whisper with age, revealing text written in the careful script of medieval scholars who had recorded their observations with the precision of scientists cataloguing natural phenomena. But the subjects of their study challenged every assumption about the nature of reality, speaking of creatures that possessed human intelligence, but operated according to principles that mortality could barely comprehend. "Listen to this account," the priest continued, his voice taking on the cadence of scholarly recitation, "from Brother Thomas of Canterbury, recorded in the year of our Lord 1237. The creature appeared as a man of noble bearing, but his movements carried the fluid grace of smoke given form. His eyes held depths that seemed to reflect eternity itself, and those who met his gaze directly reported sensations of having their very souls examined and evaluated. The wounds he inflicted were precise beyond any earthly skill, designed not merely to kill, but to draw forth the essence of life itself." Holmes absorbed this information with the methodical attention he brought to all evidence, regardless of its source or apparent credibility. His scientific training demanded skepticism, but his experience as an investigator had taught him the value of remaining open to possibilities that conventional wisdom might dismiss. The pattern described in the ancient text matched their own observations with disturbing accuracy, suggesting that the phenomena they faced possessed historical precedent extending back centuries. "The methods of confrontation," Holmes inquired, "are they documented with equal precision?" Father Mackenzie turned pages with reverent care, revealing sections that dealt with practical applications of spiritual knowledge against supernatural threats. The text was annotated with symbols and diagrams that spoke of careful study by generations of scholars who had dedicated their lives to understanding forces that existed beyond ordinary human experience. Each page seemed to contain wisdom earned through confrontation with darkness in its most literal sense. "The traditional protections remain effective," the priest said, his voice carrying the confidence of tested knowledge. "Wooden stakes crafted from trees that have grown in consecrated ground, water blessed through proper ritual, mirrors of pure silver that can reflect not merely physical forms but spiritual essence. But most important is the strength of will and purity of purpose possessed by those who would stand against such creatures." Watson considered the implications from his medical perspective, recognizing that they were discussing matters that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life, death, and consciousness itself. "The precision of the wounds you describe," he said thoughtfully, "suggests not merely supernatural ability but retained human knowledge. These creatures maintain their intelligence after transformation, possibly enhanced by their changed state." "Indeed," Father Mackenzie agreed, his expression reflecting years of study devoted to understanding such transformations. "They retain all their human cunning while gaining abilities that transcend mortal limitations. This makes them infinitely more dangerous than mere wild beasts or simple killers. They can plan, adapt, learn from their experiences, and modify their methods to overcome new obstacles." The conversation continued through the morning hours, each exchange adding layers to their understanding while simultaneously revealing the magnitude of the challenge they faced. The priest's knowledge, earned through centuries of ecclesiastical experience with supernatural threats, provided context that scientific training alone could never supply. Yet Holmes found himself able to synthesize this ancient wisdom with modern investigative techniques, creating approaches that honoured both faith and reason. As the church bells chimed noon with bronze voices that seemed to carry benedictions across London's sprawling landscape, Holmes and Watson prepared to continue their investigation, armed with knowledge that existed at the intersection of science and spirituality. Father Mackenzie blessed their endeavour with words that carried the weight of institutional authority, backed by generations of successful confrontation with forces of darkness. "Remember," the priest said as they prepared to leave the sanctuary of the church, "you face intelligences that have had centuries to perfect their methods of predation. They understand human nature in ways that most humans never achieve, having observed it from the perspective of creatures who retain memory of mortality while existing beyond its limitations. Your greatest advantage lies not in superior force, but in the unpredictability of minds they have not yet had the opportunity to study and catalogue." The afternoon found them in the reading room of the British Museum, where Holmes had arranged access to documents and artefacts that spoke of humanity's long history of encounter with supernatural forces. The vast hall buzzed with the quiet intensity of scholars pursuing knowledge across every conceivable field of study, their combined intellectual energy creating an atmosphere charged with the potential for discovery and revelation. Holmes moved through the collection with the focused efficiency of a man who knew precisely what he sought, his long fingers dancing across catalogue entries with the skill of a pianist finding familiar melodies. The materials he selected represented the accumulated wisdom of cultures spanning continents and centuries, each contribution adding pieces to a puzzle that academic orthodoxy preferred to ignore. "Egyptian accounts of the undead who walked in darkness," he murmured, arranging documents with the care of a curator preparing a precious exhibition. "Romanian folklore describing creatures of the night who drained life force from their victims. Chinese texts speak of vampiric spirits that retained human intelligence while possessing supernatural abilities. The consistency of description across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests we are dealing with documented phenomena rather than mere mythology." Watson studied these ancient texts with the wonder of a scientist discovering new species, his medical training providing perspective on the physiological transformations described in languages ranging from Latin to Sanskrit. Each account spoke of creatures that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and death, suggesting that reality possessed layers of complexity that modern science had barely begun to explore. "The transformation process," Watson observed, tracing diagrams that illustrated the progression from human to something beyond mortality, appears to involve fundamental alterations to blood chemistry, cellular structure, and nervous system function. Yet consciousness remains intact, possibly enhanced by the changes. We are dealing with evolution guided by forces that operate outside natural selection. As the afternoon wore on, they assembled a comprehensive understanding of their adversary that combined ancient wisdom with modern analytical techniques. The creature they faced was not merely a supernatural threat, but an intelligence that possessed centuries of experience in manipulating human psychology and exploiting the weaknesses inherent in mortal understanding. Their investigation had revealed an opponent worthy of respect, even as it demanded their most determined opposition. The evening brought them back to Whitechapel, armed with knowledge that transformed their understanding of both the mystery they faced and the methods required for its solution. The fog was beginning to gather again as sunset painted London's skyline in shades of amber and gold, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. Tonight would bring another opportunity for observation, but this time they would be prepared for what they might encounter. They established their surveillance position in a building that commanded views of multiple streets, while offering concealment from observation by their supernatural quarry. Holmes arranged his equipment with the precision of a surgeon preparing for complex surgery, the blessed silver mirror positioned to reflect approaches from multiple directions, wooden stakes carved from consecrated oak within easy reach, holy water in vessels blessed by ecclesiastical authority. Watson checked his medical bag with the thoroughness that had become automatic after years of practice. but tonight it contained items that would have seemed out of place in conventional medicine. Alongside his traditional instruments lay implements blessed by religious authority and substances that existed at the intersection of chemistry and spiritual protection. His role tonight would extend beyond mere medical support to active participation in confrontation with forces that challenged everything he had learned about the nature of reality. As darkness claimed the streets of Whitechapel with the inevitability of tide, the fog began its nightly transformation of familiar geography into mysterious landscape, where shadows possessed agency and movement, carried implications beyond mere locomotion. Gas lamps struggled to penetrate the thickening atmosphere, creating islands of illumination that seemed to float suspended in grey nothingness, like beacons marking safe passage through treacherous waters. The waiting began with the patient intensity of hunters who understood that success depended upon perfect timing and flawless execution. Holmes positioned himself where his sharp eyes could monitor the complex geography of streets and alleys that comprised their observation zone, while Watson maintained watch from a complementary angle that would allow them to coordinate their response to whatever phenomena might manifest. The first sign of supernatural presence came not through visual observation, but rather through subtle changes in atmospheric pressure that seemed to announce the approach of something that existed outside normal physical law. The fog began to move in patterns too purposeful for natural explanation, swirling in spirals that created brief clearings before closing again like curtains drawn by invisible hands, operating according to theatrical rather than meteorological principles. Then, as if materializing from the very essence of night itself, the figure they had observed previously began to emerge from the fog with movements that seemed to flow rather than step. But tonight was different. Tonight he was not alone. 3 figures moved through the mist with synchronized grace that spoke of coordination guided by intelligence far older and more sophisticated than human understanding could easily grasp. Holmes felt his breath catch as he observed the supernatural ballet unfolding in the street below. Each figure possessed the same ethereal quality of movement, the same pale perfection of features, the same eyes that seemed to hold depths reflecting eternity itself. But there were subtle differences in their bearing and manner that suggested individual personalities retained despite their transformation into something beyond mortality. The leader, whom they had observed on the previous night, moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to command. His gestures directed his companions with economy of motion that spoke of perfect understanding between beings who had shared centuries of existence together. When he paused to survey their surroundings, his ancient eyes seemed to catalogue every detail with the precision of a military commander assessing tactical terrain. His companions deferred to his authority with the natural grace of predators who had learned to hunt as a coordinated pack. One possessed the delicate features and graceful movements that suggested aristocratic origins, while the other bore the broader build and practical bearing of someone who had known manual labour before transformation elevated him beyond such mundane concerns. Yet both now moved with the supernatural grace that marked their elevation from mortality to something that transcended human limitations. Watson observed their interaction with the fascination of a scientist studying complex social behaviour among species previously unknown to science. "They retain human social structures," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to Holmes positioned mere feet away. "Leadership, deference, coordinated action. Transformation has not eliminated their capacity for organised behaviour, but rather enhanced it beyond human limitations." Holmes nodded silently, his attention focused on cataloguing every detail of their supernatural quarry's behaviour patterns. The vampires, for that was clearly what they were, moved through Whitechapel's fog-shrouded streets with the confidence of apex predators surveying territory they had claimed through centuries of dominion. Their very presence seemed to alter the quality of atmosphere around them, creating zones of influence that extended beyond their immediate physical location. As the trio continued their nocturnal patrol, Holmes and Watson observed hunting behaviour that combined supernatural ability with strategic intelligence that had been refined through decades of successful predation. The vampires communicated through subtle gestures and expressions that spoke of perfect understanding developed through shared experience, their coordination as precise as that of dancers who had rehearsed their performance until every movement flowed with inevitable grace. The leader raised his hand in a signal that brought his companions to immediate stillness, their supernatural senses apparently detecting something that remained invisible to human observation. For long moments they remained motionless, their heads tilted in attitudes of listening that seemed to extend beyond mere auditory perception into realms where consciousness could directly perceive the emotional and spiritual states of potential prey. Then, with movements too swift for ordinary vision to follow, they dispersed into the fog with purposes that carried the deadly efficiency of predators who had identified suitable quarry. Holmes felt his pulse quicken as he realised they were witnessing the beginning of a hunt that would likely claim another victim unless intervention proved possible. But confronting three supernatural beings possessed of centuries of experience and abilities that transcended human limitations would require careful planning and precise execution. "We must follow," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a commander making tactical decisions under extreme pressure, but at a distance sufficient to avoid detection while maintaining observation of their activities. "If we are to prevent another death, we must understand their methods well enough to predict and interrupt their attack." They left their observation post with movements designed to minimize sound and visual detection, their progress through fog-shrouded streets guided by the supernatural grace they had observed in their quarry, but executed with purely human determination and courage. The vampires had dispersed into the complex geography of Whitechapel's narrow alleys, but their supernatural presence created disturbances in atmospheric pressure that could be tracked by observers trained to recognize such subtle phenomena. Watson followed Holmes through the maze of streets and passages that comprised Whitechapel's secret geography, his medical bag secure at his side and his mind focused on the unprecedented nature of their mission. They were attempting to track and potentially confront creatures that possessed abilities far beyond human limitations, armed with nothing more than ancient knowledge, blessed implements, and the determination to protect innocent lives from supernatural predation. The fog seemed to thicken around them as they moved deeper into the heart of Whitechapel, creating an environment where visibility extended barely beyond arm's length and familiar landmarks became unreliable guides for navigation. Yet Holmes moved with the confidence of someone following tracks invisible to ordinary perception, his sharp instincts leading them through the labyrinth with purposes as determined as those of their supernatural quarry. They emerged from a narrow alley onto a broader street where gas lamps struggled to penetrate the atmosphere thick as cotton wool, creating halos of light that seemed to float suspended in grey nothingness. Here, the trail they had been following suddenly intensified, suggesting that their quarry had paused in this location for purposes that required extended attention rather than mere passage through territory. Holmes raised his hand in a signal for complete silence, his grey eyes scanning the limited visibility around them with the focused intensity of a hunter who sensed the proximity of dangerous prey. Somewhere in the fog ahead, supernatural predators were engaged in activities that would likely claim human life, unless intervention proved both possible and effective. The sound that reached them through the dense atmosphere was unlike anything in Watson's experience as either military surgeon or civilian physician. It carried qualities that seemed to bypass rational hearing and reached directly into primitive regions of consciousness where fear existed as pure instinct unmediated by logical thought. The sound spoke of feeding that transcended mere physical consumption, of spiritual predation that drained essence along with blood. Watson felt every instinct demanding retreat from forces too powerful and alien for successful confrontation, but his medical oath and personal loyalty to Holmes provided anchors of purpose that held him steady against the psychological assault of supernatural terror. They had come too far and learned too much to abandon their mission when intervention might mean the difference between life and death for an innocent victim. Holmes moved forward through the fog with movements that seemed guided by senses beyond the merely physical, his tall frame cutting through grey atmosphere like a ship navigating by instruments rather than sight. Watson followed close behind, his medical training automatically cataloguing the physiological effects of fear, while his conscious mind remained focused on the immediate requirements of their unprecedented situation. They found the vampires in a small courtyard surrounded by towering tenements, whose brick walls rose like cliffs into fog-shrouded darkness overhead. The three supernatural beings had arranged themselves in a triangle around a figure whose struggles had already weakened to the point where resistance represented little more than a reflexive response to approaching dissolution. The victim was a young woman whose face bore the particular combination of beauty and desperation that marks so many of Whitechapel's residents, someone who had learned to survive through courage and resourcefulness, but now found herself confronting forces that rendered human strength irrelevant. The feeding process was conducted with ritual precision that spoke of practices refined through centuries of repetition, each vampire participating according to roles that had been established through long experience with coordinated predation. The leader maintained control over the victim's consciousness through direct eye contact that seemed to create hypnotic suspension of will, while his companions prepared to drain physical essence with implements that transcended ordinary understanding of anatomy and physiology. Watson's medical training rebelled against the systematic violation of everything he had sworn to protect, but his scientific curiosity noted details that would prove crucial for understanding the true nature of vampiric transformation. The creature's fangs were not merely enlarged canine teeth, but rather complex instruments that seemed designed for precision extraction of specific blood components. Their movements carried surgical precision that suggested retained human knowledge enhanced by supernatural perception of cardiovascular and nervous system function. Holmes stepped forward from concealment with movements that seemed to flow like water given purpose, his presence announced not through dramatic gesture, but rather through the quiet authority of someone prepared to confront ultimate evil with nothing more than determination and carefully acquired knowledge. The wooden stake in his right hand had been carved from oak that had grown in consecrated ground, while his left held the silver mirror that could reflect spiritual essence as well as physical form. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the calm precision of someone addressing colleagues rather than supernatural predators, "I believe you have something that belongs to the realm of the living." The vampire's reaction was instantaneous and synchronized, their supernatural senses immediately recognizing threat from sources they had not anticipated encountering in their carefully claimed territory. The leader released his hypnotic hold on the victim and turned to face Holmes with movements that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated grace and menace. His ancient eyes reflected depths of experience that included countless confrontations with humans who had dared to challenge vampiric dominion, but something in Holmes's bearing suggested this encounter might prove different from previous such meetings. "Indeed," the vampire leader replied, his voice carrying accents that spoke of aristocratic origins refined by centuries of existence beyond mortal concerns. "And I believe you have stumbled into affairs that transcend human understanding or intervention. Turn away now, and you may yet see another dawn." Holmes smiled with the warm confidence that had disarmed opponents ranging from street criminals to criminal masterminds, his manner suggesting neither fear nor aggression, but rather the professional courtesy of one expert acknowledging another. "I appreciate your concern for our welfare," he replied, his tone maintaining the conversational quality of civilized discourse. "But duty requires that we remain until this matter reaches satisfactory resolution." The confrontation that followed would be remembered by both participants as a defining moment in the eternal struggle between forces of light and darkness, reason and superstition, human determination and supernatural power. But as Holmes and Watson faced creatures that possessed centuries of experience in defeating human opposition, they carried weapons that transcended mere physical implements. They carried knowledge, purpose, and the unshakable conviction that no force, regardless of its apparent power, could long withstand the combined assault of courage guided by understanding. The fog swirled around them like an audience gathering to witness a performance that would determine not merely the fate of individual participants, but the balance of power between mortality and the forces that sought to prey upon it. In this courtyard hidden in the heart of Whitechapel, where gaslight struggled to penetrate the atmosphere thick with supernatural presence, two men with nothing more than human determination prepared to confront eternity itself. Watson stepped forward to stand beside his friend, his medical bag exchanged for weapons blessed by ecclesiastical authority and sanctified by purpose that transcended personal safety. Together, they represented humanity's refusal to accept predation as inevitable, mortality's challenge to forces that claim dominion over life and death itself. The vampires recognized the magnitude of challenge presented by opponents who approached supernatural confrontation with scientific preparation and spiritual armament. For the first time in centuries of unchallenged predation, they faced humans who understood their nature well enough to employ effective countermeasures, who possessed both the knowledge and courage necessary to threaten their very existence. The battle that would unfold in this fog-shrouded courtyard would be remembered in whispered legends told around fires when the night grew deep and shadows seemed to move with purpose beyond explanation. But as the forces of light and darkness gathered themselves for confrontation, the ultimate outcome remained balanced on the edge of possibility, awaiting resolution through courage, determination, and the ancient truth that good, properly armed with knowledge and guided by purpose, could triumph even over evil that had perfected its methods through centuries of successful predation. The fog seemed to hold its breath as mortal determination faced immortal hunger, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, London continued its eternal rhythms, unaware that its very soul hung in balance within a small courtyard where heroes prepared to write their names in the Book of Light, with weapons of faith and silver, wood and steel, knowledge and unwavering courage that refused to yield before any darkness, no matter how ancient or powerful its claim to dominion over human hearts. The vampire leader moved first, his form dissolving into mist that seemed to flow like water, given malevolent purpose, reforming behind Holmes with movements too swift for ordinary vision to track. But the detective had anticipated such supernatural mobility, his blessed silver mirror reflecting not merely physical form but spiritual essence, creating confusion in senses that had grown accustomed to centuries of unchallenged predatory advantage. The wooden stake in Holmes's hand found its mark with precision, guided by scientific knowledge of anatomy combined with spiritual understanding of vampiric vulnerability. The ancient oak, blessed by ecclesiastical authority and sharpened to surgical precision, pierced the creature's heart with the inevitability of justice finally claiming its due. The vampire's scream echoed off surrounding walls like the sound of a soul being torn from moorings that had anchored it beyond death for centuries. Watson engaged the second vampire with movements that combined medical precision with military training, his blessed implements creating barriers of spiritual force that the creature could not cross through supernatural ability alone. The holy water burned against vampiric flesh like acid given divine purpose, while the silver crucifix in his other hand blazed with light that seemed to emanate from sources beyond mere reflected illumination. The third vampire, seeing his companions facing destruction for the first time in their extended existence, attempted retreat into the fog that had served as concealment and hunting ground for countless previous nights. But Holmes had positioned himself with strategic precision that accounted for such attempted escape, his second stake finding its target with the accuracy of mathematical calculation, guided by unwavering purpose. As the supernatural predators crumbled into dust that was carried away by winds suddenly cleansed of malevolent presence, the rescued victim began to regain consciousness with the gradual return of natural colour to her features. Watson knelt beside her with the gentle expertise of a physician accustomed to treating trauma that extended beyond mere physical injury, his medical bag once again containing conventional instruments dedicated to healing rather than supernatural warfare. "You're safe now," he said in the soothing voice that had comforted countless patients through their darkest hours. "The creatures that held you have been destroyed, and you need not fear them any more." Holmes stood over the small piles of dust that had moments before represented centuries of accumulated evil. his grey eyes reflecting satisfaction tempered with recognition of the larger implications of their victory. They had eliminated 3 vampires whose predation had terrorised Whitechapel, but the very fact of their existence suggested that other such creatures might yet walk the fog-shrouded streets of London. "The immediate threat has been neutralised," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of successful completion of dangerous duty. "But our investigation must continue until we can be certain that no other such creatures threaten innocent lives." The fog began to lift as dawn approached with the gentle persistence of hope, overcoming despair, revealing familiar street geography that seemed somehow purified by the night's confrontation between forces of light and darkness. The gas lamps flickered and dimmed as morning light began its conquest of shadow, transforming the mysterious landscape back into the mundane reality of cobblestones and brick buildings, where ordinary people pursued ordinary lives, unaware of the supernatural battle that had preserved their safety. They escorted the rescued woman to the safety of the local church, where Father Mackenzie received her with the compassionate expertise of a spiritual physician accustomed to treating souls damaged by encounters with evil that transcended human understanding. His gentle ministrations would help restore not merely her physical health, but also the psychological equilibrium that direct contact with vampiric predation had temporarily shattered. "You have done extraordinary service," the priest said as Holmes and Watson prepared to continue their investigation. "But remember that victory against supernatural evil requires not merely successful confrontation, but also vigilant protection against future manifestation of such threats. The darkness that gave birth to these creatures may yet spawn others if proper precautions are not maintained." The morning brought them back to Baker Street with the satisfaction of duty successfully completed, but also with recognition that their work in Whitechapel represented only the beginning of a larger responsibility. They had discovered that London harboured supernatural threats that challenged everything rational thought assumed about the nature of reality, and with such knowledge came the obligation to protect innocent lives from predators whose existence defied conventional understanding. Mrs. Hudson greeted their return with the warmth of someone who had spent anxious hours hoping for their safe arrival, her motherly concern evident in the careful attention she paid to their appearance for signs of injury or distress. The breakfast she prepared seemed to glow with domestic comfort that provided welcome contrast to the supernatural horrors they had confronted in Whitechapel's fog-shrouded streets. "The newspapers will speak of another mysterious disappearance that ended happily," Holmes said, as he settled into his familiar chair with movements that seemed to draw strength from familiar surroundings. "They will never know that 3 ancient predators met their final destruction at the hands of mortal men, armed with nothing more than knowledge, courage, and weapons blessed by spiritual authority." Watson nodded thoughtfully as he arranged his medical implements with the careful precision that had become automatic through years of practice. "But we will know," he replied, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction balanced with recognition of ongoing responsibility. "And should similar threats manifest in the future, we possess both the knowledge and experience necessary to protect innocent lives from supernatural predation." The fire crackled its ancient song of warmth and safety, while outside London continued its eternal rhythms, the great city breathing with the steady pulse of millions of lives pursuing their individual purposes within the larger tapestry of human civilization. In Baker Street, 2 men sat in comfortable chairs and reflected on mysteries that had challenged their understanding, while strengthening their resolve to stand between ordinary humanity and forces that sought to prey upon innocence and vulnerability. Holmes opened one of his books to pages that spoke of other supernatural threats documented throughout history, his grey eyes moving across text with the focused attention of a scholar preparing for examinations that might yet come. The vampire menace had been eliminated from Whitechapel, but the very fact of its existence suggested that reality contained layers of complexity that scientific rationalism had barely begun to explore. "There will be other cases," he said quietly, his voice carrying the certainty of a mind that had learned to perceive patterns invisible to ordinary observation. "Other manifestations of forces that exist in the spaces between conventional understanding and ancient wisdom. We have proven that such threats can be successfully confronted by mortals properly prepared and sufficiently determined. Watson settled back in his chair with the comfortable exhaustion that followed successful completion of dangerous duty, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that seemed to contain more than mere warmth and refreshment. He had witnessed phenomena that challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of life, death, and consciousness. Yet rather than undermining his faith in human capability, the experience had strengthened his conviction that courage guided by knowledge could triumph over any darkness. "The people of Whitechapel sleep safely tonight," he said, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction that came from medical service successfully rendered. "Children will play in streets no longer haunted by ancient predators, and their parents need not fear that supernatural evil walks among them seeking vulnerable prey." The afternoon brought visitors seeking Holmes's assistance with mysteries that seemed mundane compared to vampiric predation, yet the detective received each client with the same careful attention he had always devoted to human problems, regardless of their apparent complexity. A wealthy merchant sought help recovering stolen goods. A concerned mother wanted her missing son located. An elderly gentleman required assistance proving his rightful inheritance, the familiar rhythm of ordinary crime and human difficulty that comprised the normal fabric of detective work. But even as Holmes applied his legendary powers of deduction to these conventional cases, his mind remained partially focused on the larger implications of what they had discovered in Whitechapel. The existence of vampires in modern London suggested that reality possessed dimensions that academic study preferred to ignore, spaces where ancient knowledge retained practical relevance despite centuries of scientific progress that had supposedly rendered such concerns obsolete. Watson spent his afternoon updating his medical records with observations that would never find their way into official journals or medical texts. The physiological effects of vampiric predation, the spiritual trauma inflicted by supernatural assault, the healing properties of blessed water and consecrated implements, all represented knowledge that existed at the intersection of medicine and metaphysics, science and faith. His careful documentation would serve as a reference material for future encounters with forces that challenged conventional understanding of human physiology and psychology. As evening approached with its familiar ritual of gas lamps being lit throughout London's sprawling neighbourhoods, Holmes and Watson found themselves drawn back to their windows overlooking Baker Street. The fog was beginning to gather again, but tonight it seemed somehow gentler, lacking the malevolent quality that had characterised the atmospheric conditions during their supernatural investigations. The very air seemed cleaner, as if the elimination of vampiric presence had purified London's evening mists. "I find myself contemplating the nature of evil," Holmes said, his voice carrying the reflective tone that marked his deepest philosophical considerations. "We have witnessed creatures that retained human intelligence while being transformed into something that preyed upon humanity with methodical precision. Yet in their destruction, they revealed themselves to be ultimately vulnerable to human determination guided by ancient wisdom." Watson nodded thoughtfully, his medical training providing perspective on the broader implications of their recent experiences. The transformation they had undergone, he observed, represented a perversion of natural processes, death without true ending, consciousness without moral constraint, intelligence without compassion. In essence, they have become the antithesis of everything that makes humanity worthy of preservation. The detective rose from his chair and moved to his desk, where he began arranging the various implements and substances that had proven effective against supernatural predation. The wooden stakes carved from consecrated oak, the silver mirror that reflected spiritual essence, the vials of holy water blessed by ecclesiastical authority, each item represented humanity's age-old struggle against forces that sought to corrupt or destroy the fundamental values that distinguish civilization from chaos. "Yet what strikes me most profoundly," Holmes continued, "is the degree to which traditional knowledge proved superior to modern methodology in confronting such threats. Our scientific instruments were useless against creatures that existed outside natural law, while implements blessed by religious authority provided the precise tools necessary for effective intervention." As the evening deepened and London settled into its familiar rhythms of nightlife, Holmes and Watson received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street with the slightly uncomfortable bearing of a man who had come to discuss matters that challenged his professional understanding of crime and investigation. His weathered face bore evidence of sleepless nights spent trying to comprehend events that defied conventional police methodology. "Gentlemen," Lestrade said as he settled into the chair that Holmes offered, "I've come to discuss the rather extraordinary reports emerging from Whitechapel. It appears that the series of mysterious deaths has suddenly ceased, and witnesses speak of supernatural encounters involving figures who match your descriptions perfectly." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Watson, recognizing that their activities had not gone entirely unnoticed by official authorities. The inspector's presence represented both validation of their success and potential complications regarding the documentation of events that most rational minds would dismiss as fantasy or delusion. "Inspector," Holmes replied carefully, "I believe you'll find that the immediate threat to Whitechapel's residents has been eliminated through methods that combined conventional investigation with unconventional intervention. The perpetrators have been permanently neutralized, and no further such crimes should occur in that particular pattern." Lestrade's expression grew thoughtful as he processed the implications of Holmes's words. His years of police work had taught him to recognize when reliable sources spoke with the authority of direct experience, even when the subject matter challenged everything he thought he understood about criminal investigation. "The thing is," Lestrade continued, "we've had reports from reliable witnesses describing events that sound more like something from a Gothic novel than actual police business. Figures dissolving into mist, confrontations involving religious artifacts, piles of dust where perpetrators should have been, the sort of thing that would normally be dismissed as the ravings of gin-soaked imaginations." Watson leaned forward in his chair, bringing his medical expertise to bear on the inspector's obvious distress. "What you're describing," he said gently, "represents the collision between rational expectation and irrational reality. When confronted with phenomena that exist outside normal parameters, even reliable witnesses struggle to provide credible accounts of their experiences." The inspector nodded slowly, his expression reflecting the particular fatigue that came from trying to reconcile impossible evidence with professional responsibility. "The difficulty," he said, "lies in writing reports that acknowledge the successful resolution of the case, while avoiding details that would result in my immediate suspension from the force for mental instability." Holmes smiled with the warm understanding that had made him a trusted confidant to everyone from street criminals to government officials. "Perhaps," he suggested, "your reports might focus on the elimination of the threat through the diligent investigation and decisive action of consulting detectives working in cooperation with local religious authorities. The specific methodologies employed need not be detailed beyond noting their effectiveness in achieving the desired outcome." As the evening wore on, the three men discussed the broader implications of their recent discoveries regarding supernatural threats operating within London's complex urban environment. Each brought his own perspective to the conversation, Holmes with his analytical approach to mystery and deduction, Watson with his medical understanding of human psychology and physiology, Lestrade with his practical knowledge of law enforcement in a city where conventional crime already challenged every available resource. "What concerns me most," Lestrade admitted, "is the possibility that other such threats may exist undetected throughout London. If creatures like those you eliminated in Whitechapel can operate unnoticed for extended periods, what other supernatural predators might be preying upon innocent citizens without our knowledge?" Holmes considered this question with the systematic thoroughness he brought to all complex problems. "Your concern is well-founded," he replied, "but I believe our experience in Whitechapel provides both warning and solution. Such creatures reveal themselves through patterns that can be detected by observers trained to recognize supernatural manifestations. The key lies in maintaining vigilance while developing methods for rapid response when intervention becomes necessary." Watson added his own perspective based on medical observation of the victims and witnesses they had encountered. The physiological and psychological effects of supernatural predation, he noted, create distinctive symptoms that can serve as early warning systems for communities under threat. Proper training of medical personnel and religious authorities could provide networks for detecting and responding to such manifestations. As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11 with bronze voices that seemed to carry benedictions through the comfortable warmth of the sitting room, Inspector Lestrade prepared to return to his duties with a new understanding of the complexities involved in protecting London's citizens. His visit had transformed their private victory into the beginning of a larger responsibility, the establishment of knowledge and procedures that could protect the city from future supernatural threats. I shall arrange for certain trusted colleagues to receive discreet briefings on recognizing and reporting unusual patterns that might indicate supernatural predation, Lestrade said as he prepared to leave. And I believe Father Mackenzie has expressed interest in coordinating with medical authorities regarding the identification and treatment of victims who survive encounters with such creatures. After the inspector's departure, Holmes and Watson found themselves contemplating the evolution of their partnership from conventional detective work into something that resembled a specialised form of supernatural investigation. The skills and knowledge they had developed through their Whitechapel experience suggested possibilities for future service that extended far beyond ordinary crime solving. "We have become," Watson observed, "practitioners of a discipline that combines scientific methodology with ancient wisdom, rational investigation with spiritual warfare. It occurs to me that London may need such specialists more often than we might expect." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his grey eyes reflecting depths of understanding earned through direct confrontation with forces that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. "Indeed," he replied, "and I suspect our recent experiences represent merely the beginning of a longer journey into territories where conventional knowledge proves inadequate to the challenges we face." The following days brought a series of subtle changes to the rhythm of life in Whitechapel that spoke of supernatural influence finally lifted from streets that had known too much fear and suffering. Children played with renewed freedom in alleys where shadows had recently held menace, while their parents moved with the relaxed confidence of people no longer obligated to peer nervously into every darkened doorway or fog-shrouded corner. The local newspapers, constrained by editorial policies that demanded rational explanation for all reported events, struggled to account for the sudden improvement in public safety through conventional criminal investigation terminology. Their articles spoke vaguely of increased police patrols and improved community cooperation, avoiding any mention of the supernatural elements that had actually determined the outcome of the case. But in the 10 Bells public house, where conversation still moved in careful undertones whenever discussion turned to recent events, the residents of Whitechapel preserved their own version of what had transpired during those terrifying weeks when ancient evil had walked among them. Their stories, told around fires and shared over evening meals, would become part of the neighbourhood's collective memory, legends that carried practical knowledge disguised as entertainment. Holmes spent his mornings continuing his research into historical accounts of supernatural manifestations, building a comprehensive library of knowledge that might prove essential for future cases. His systematic approach to cataloguing information about vampires, ghosts, demonic possession, and other phenomena that existed outside conventional scientific understanding represented perhaps the first serious attempt to apply modern investigative techniques to subjects that academic orthodoxy preferred to ignore. Watson devoted his attention to developing medical protocols for treating victims of supernatural assault, drawing upon both conventional therapeutic techniques and spiritual healing methods that had proven effective in restoring psychological equilibrium to those who had survived encounters with forces beyond normal human experience. His careful documentation would provide invaluable guidance for physicians who might find themselves confronting symptoms that no medical school had prepared them to recognise or treat. As autumn deepened and London settled into the comfortable rhythms of shorter days and longer evenings, Holmes and Watson received their first request for assistance with a case that appeared to involve supernatural elements. A country gentleman wrote from his estate in Yorkshire, describing phenomena that included strange sounds in the night, objects moving without apparent cause, and family members experiencing dreams that seemed more like visitations from deceased relatives than ordinary sleeping visions. "It appears," Holmes said as he finished reading the letter aloud, "that word of our specialised capabilities has begun to circulate among those who find themselves confronting mysteries that conventional authorities cannot address. We are being invited to investigate what the writer describes as a haunting of most persistent and troubling nature." Watson felt the familiar stirring of excitement that came with the prospect of new challenges requiring the unique combination of skills they had developed through their Whitechapel experience. The symptoms described, he observed, suggests spiritual manifestation rather than vampiric predation, which would require different investigative approaches and different countermeasures. We are being offered opportunity to expand our understanding of supernatural phenomena beyond the specific case of blood-drinking creatures. They spent the evening planning their Yorkshire investigation, with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterised their preparation for confronting the Whitechapel vampires. But this time their planning included considerations of portable equipment for detecting and measuring paranormal activity, procedures for communicating with spiritual entities that might retain consciousness after death, and methods for distinguishing between genuine supernatural manifestation and psychological phenomena that might produce similar symptoms. "We are establishing," Holmes remarked, "the foundations of a new scientific discipline, one that applies rational methodology to subjects that have traditionally been relegated to the realm of superstition and folklore. Our work represents the beginning of systematic investigation into phenomena that exist at the intersection of natural and supernatural law." As they prepared for bed that night, Holmes and Watson reflected on the extraordinary transformation their partnership had undergone during the week since Inspector Lestrade's first letter about the mysterious deaths in Whitechapel. They had evolved from conventional consulting detectives into something unprecedented, investigators equipped to confront forces that challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying modern rational thought. "Whatever awaits us in Yorkshire," Watson said as he prepared his travelling medical kit with implements both conventional and consecrated, "we approach it with knowledge earned through successful confrontation with supernatural evil. We have proven that human determination, properly guided by ancient wisdom and armed with appropriate tools, can triumph over forces that seem beyond mortal capability to challenge." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his tall frame silhouetted against the window, where autumn rain created percussion against glass that seemed to echo with promise of adventures yet to come. "Indeed," he replied, "and more importantly, we have demonstrated that the age of reason need not exclude consideration of realities that reason alone cannot fully comprehend. There is room in our scientific worldview for mysteries that require both intellectual analysis and spiritual understanding." The fire settled into glowing embers that pulsed like a heartbeat, in the familiar warmth of their sitting room, while outside London breathed its eternal rhythms, and somewhere in the darkness, other mysteries waited for the attention of men who had learned to navigate the spaces between conventional understanding and ancient wisdom. In Baker Street, two friends prepared for sleep with the satisfaction of duty successfully completed and the anticipation of challenges yet to come. The morning would bring new cases, new mysteries, and new opportunities to serve as guardians at the threshold between the world of rational explanation and the realm where legends walked, with purposes both terrible and wonderful. They had become something unique in the annals of criminal investigation, detectives equipped to pursue truth wherever it might lead, regardless of whether that truth conformed to the comfortable boundaries of conventional thought, or demanded recognition of realities that challenged everything modern civilization assumed about the nature of existence itself. As London settled into the deep rhythms of night, Holmes and Watson rested in the knowledge that they had found their true calling, not merely as solvers of mysteries, but as protectors of innocent lives against forces that predated human memory and would continue to challenge human understanding long after their own names had passed into legend. They had written their story in the eternal struggle between light and darkness, and in doing so had ensured that others would follow in their footsteps when darkness threatened to overwhelm the light. In Whitechapel, children slept safely in beds no longer haunted by ancient terrors, while their parents dreamed dreams unmarked by the fear that had once stalked their streets like hungry shadows seeking vulnerable prey. The victory was complete, the mystery solved, the threat eliminated, but more importantly, the knowledge gained through their experience would serve as both a weapon and shield in future confrontations with forces that sought to prey upon humanity's capacity for hope, love, and the innocent trust that made civilization possible. The fog drifted gently through London's sleeping streets, carrying with it the sense of coal smoke and human habitation that marked one of the world's greatest cities as it settled into peaceful rest. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, Two men who had faced eternity and emerged victorious prepared to dream. Dreams filled with the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and the gentle anticipation of mysteries yet to be solved by minds that had learned to embrace both reason and wonder as equally valid approaches to understanding the magnificent complexity of existence itself. And in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between the rational world of daylight and the mysterious realm of dreams, the legends whispered their eternal songs of courage triumphant, wisdom preserved, and light victorious over even the most ancient darkness, songs that would echo through generations yet unborn, inspiring future heroes to stand firm against whatever shadows might threaten the precious flame of human hope and determination that burns eternal in hearts brave enough to face the unknown with nothing more than faith, knowledge, and the unshakable conviction that good, properly understood and courageously applied, must always triumph over evil, regardless of how ancient or powerful that evil might claim to be. The weeks that followed their triumph in Whitechapel brought with them a profound transformation of both purpose and perspective that settled over Baker Street like morning mist carrying promises of new discoveries. Holmes found himself drawn to his books with renewed passion, but now his reading encompassed volumes that would have seemed fantastical mere months before. Ancient treatises on spiritual warfare, medieval accounts of supernatural encounters, scholarly works that bridged the gap between empirical science and metaphysical truth. The detective's grey eyes moved across pages with the hunger of a scholar who had discovered entire libraries of knowledge previously dismissed as mere superstition. Watson, meanwhile, had begun corresponding with physicians throughout Europe who had encountered similar mysterious ailments in their practice, cases where conventional medicine had proven inadequate, where healing had required approaches that honoured both body and spirit. His medical bag now contained instruments that existed at the intersection of science and faith, implements blessed by religious authority, alongside traditional surgical tools. The doctor's weathered hands moved with new confidence when arranging these hybrid implements, understanding that effective healing often required acknowledgement of forces that transcended purely physical intervention. The London autumn deepened around them with its familiar palette of amber light and gathering mist, but now every fog-shrouded evening carried different associations. Where once the grey atmosphere had suggested merely atmospheric moisture, now it spoke of veils between worlds, boundaries where the natural and supernatural might intersect in ways that challenged comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality. The gas lamps that lined Baker Street seemed to burn with warmer light, as if their flames carried protective qualities earned through proximity to those who had successfully confronted darkness. Mrs. Hudson, with the intuitive wisdom that came from decades of caring for extraordinary men engaged in extraordinary work, had begun preparing their meals with ingredients that held significance beyond mere nutrition. Garlic appeared more frequently in her cooking, not merely for flavour, but as protection against forces that might still lurk in London's shadowed corners. Salt was scattered with apparent casualness near doorways and windows, creating barriers invisible to ordinary eyes, but potentially vital for maintaining the sanctity of their domestic space. "You've been different since Whitechapel," she observed one morning as she arranged their breakfast, with the loving attention of someone who understood that nourishment extended beyond physical sustenance. "Calmer somehow, as if you found answers to questions that were troubling you more than you realised." Holmes smiled with the warmth that few beyond their intimate circle ever witnessed, his grey eyes reflecting depths of satisfaction earned through successful completion of duty that extended far beyond conventional detective work. "We have indeed found answers, Mrs. Hudson," he replied gently, "but more importantly, we have discovered that the questions themselves were more significant than we initially understood. The universe, it seems, is far more complex and wonderful than our rational age has been willing to acknowledge." Watson nodded thoughtfully as he accepted his customary cup of tea, the familiar ritual carrying new layers of meaning now that they understood how precious such ordinary moments of peace and safety truly were. "We have learned," he added, "that protecting innocent lives sometimes requires acknowledgement of forces that exist beyond conventional understanding. Our work in Whitechapel revealed responsibilities that extend far beyond solving crimes or healing bodies. We have become guardians of something far more fundamental. The correspondence that arrived each morning brought requests for assistance that would have seemed impossible to fulfill before their supernatural education. A family in Scotland wrote of ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow visitors through their manor halls, while a merchant in Wales described warehouse goods that rearranged themselves during the night, according to patterns that defied explanation. Each letter represented lives touched by mysteries that conventional authorities could not address, people desperate for help from those who had proven capable of confronting the inexplicable. Our reputation has evolved, Holmes observed as he sorted through the morning's communications with the systematic attention he brought to all evidence. We are no longer merely consulting detectives. We have become specialists in mysteries that exist at the boundary between the rational and the supernatural. London, it seems, harbours more such mysteries than we might have expected. The detective selected a letter written on expensive paper, its contents describing phenomena at a country estate where family members had begun experiencing shared dreams of remarkable vividness and apparent prophetic significance. The writer, a baronet of impeccable reputation, described visions that seemed to provide a glimpse into future events with disturbing accuracy, leaving the household uncertain whether they were blessed with gift or cursed with burden. This case presents interesting challenges, Holmes continued, his voice carrying the excitement of intellectual curiosity combined with compassionate concern for those in distress. If genuine prophetic ability has manifested within this family, we must determine whether the phenomenon represents benevolent spiritual guidance or malevolent supernatural manipulation. The distinction could prove crucial for their welfare. Watson studied the letter, with his medical training automatically assessing the psychological implications of the described experiences. Shared prophetic dreams suggest either remarkable coincidence, collective psychological phenomenon, or genuine supernatural manifestation, he observed. Our task will be distinguishing between these possibilities, while ensuring that our investigation does not cause additional distress to people already struggling with inexplicable experiences. They spent the morning planning their investigation with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized their supernatural work. But now their preparations included considerations that extended far beyond conventional detective methodology. Holmes consulted volumes on prophetic manifestation and spiritual guidance, while Watson reviewed medical literature on collective psychological phenomena and the physiological effects of precognitive experiences. We shall need to approach this case with particular sensitivity, Holmes noted as he selected instruments for measuring electromagnetic disturbances that might accompany genuine supernatural activity. Unlike our Whitechapel adversaries, these phenomena may represent benevolent forces attempting to provide guidance or warning. Our role will be interpreter rather than combatant, facilitator rather than destroyer. The journey to the country estate carried them through landscapes that seemed painted with autumn's most gentle brush. Rolling hills covered in forests of gold and crimson, streams that caught afternoon sunlight and scattered it like diamonds. Villages where smoke rose from chimneys in perfectly vertical columns that spoke of peace and domestic tranquility. The very air seemed different here, cleaner somehow, as if distance from London's industrial atmosphere had purified not merely oxygen, but the spiritual environment itself. Thornfield Manor stood against the evening sky like something from a Gothic romance, its ancient stones seeming to hold centuries of accumulated wisdom and mystery. But there was nothing sinister in its atmosphere. Rather, the building seemed to pulse with benevolent energy, as if generations of loving families had imbued the very architecture with protective warmth. Gas lamps glowed in windows with light that suggested comfort rather than concealment, while gardens surrounding the manor showed evidence of careful tending that spoke of lives lived in harmony with natural rhythms. Sir Reginald Thornfield received them in a library that rivalled Holmes's own collection, its walls lined with volumes that represented humanity's long quest for understanding across every conceivable field of knowledge. The baronet was a man whose face bore the particular combination of intelligence and bewilderment that marked someone confronting phenomena that challenged comfortable assumptions about how reality operated. His family, wife and 2 young adult children, showed similar expressions of curiosity mixed with concern. "Gentlemen," Sir Reginald began, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone accustomed to reasoned discourse, "I hardly know how to describe what we have been experiencing. It began 3 months ago with dreams of unusual vividness, but they have evolved into something that challenges everything we thought we understood about the nature of sleep and consciousness." Lady Thornfield, a woman whose elegant bearing suggested both strength and sensitivity, added her own perspective to the account. "The dreams are shared," she explained, her voice carrying wonder tinged with uncertainty. "We find ourselves experiencing identical visions that provide a glimpse into events that subsequently occur exactly as we witnessed them during sleep. It is as if some benevolent force has chosen to grant us sight beyond normal perception." Their daughter, Miss Eleanor Thornfield, possessed the particular combination of beauty and intelligence that marked young women who had been raised to think for themselves while maintaining appropriate social graces. "The most disturbing aspect," she observed thoughtfully, "is our growing sense that these visions carry responsibility. If we can perceive future events, do we not bear the obligation to act upon such knowledge? But how does one explain the source of information that cannot be rationally documented?" Holmes listened with the focused attention he brought to all testimony, recognizing that these people were describing experiences that existed at the very edge of human understanding. Their obvious sincerity, combined with their evident intelligence and social standing, suggested that whatever they were experiencing transcended mere imagination or psychological delusion. "These shared visions," Holmes inquired carefully, "do they occur during natural sleep, or are they induced through particular circumstances or rituals?" The family exchanged glances that spoke of shared experience too profound for easy explanation. Young Master James Thornfield, whose bearing suggested the serious-minded nature that often marked eldest sons of responsible families, answered with the precision of someone who had given considerable thought to the question. "They occur spontaneously during ordinary sleep," he replied, "but they seem most vivid when we retire to rest with minds focused on particular concerns or questions. It is as if the act of seeking guidance somehow opens channels of communication that normally remain closed to conscious awareness." Watson brought his medical training to bear on the phenomenon, recognizing elements that suggested both psychological and potentially supernatural components. "The physiological effects of these experiences," he observed, "do they resemble ordinary dreaming, or do they carry different characteristics? Unusual fatigue, heightened awareness, physical sensations that persist after awakening?" Lady Thornfield's expression grew thoughtful as she considered the doctor's question. "The dreams leave us remarkably refreshed rather than fatigued," she replied, "as if sleep has provided not merely rest but genuine spiritual nourishment. We wake with clarity of mind and sense of purpose that ordinary dreams never provide. The visions themselves feel more vivid than waking experience. Colours more intense, sounds more clear, emotional resonance deeper than anything we encounter during ordinary consciousness." Holmes spent the evening examining the manor for signs of supernatural influence, but what he discovered differed markedly from the malevolent presence they had confronted in Whitechapel. Here, the very atmosphere seemed charged with benevolent energy, as if the building itself had become a conduit for forces dedicated to protecting and guiding rather than preying upon human welfare. His instruments detected electromagnetic disturbances, but they carried harmonic patterns that suggested order rather than chaos, purpose rather than malevolence. "This is remarkable," he murmured, as he studied readings that defied conventional scientific explanation, while suggesting phenomena of extraordinary significance. "The supernatural forces present here appear to be operating according to principles of guidance and protection rather than predation. We are witnessing manifestation of benevolent spiritual activity, something far rarer and more precious than the malevolent entities we encountered in London. That night, as guests in rooms prepared with the gracious hospitality that marked truly civilized households, Holmes and Watson found themselves experiencing the shared visions that had so profoundly affected the Thornfield family. The dreams came with clarity that transcended ordinary sleeping consciousness, carrying them into realms where time seemed fluid and perception extended far beyond normal sensory limitations. They witnessed scenes of future possibilities, some joyful, others troubling, that seemed designed to provide guidance for decisions yet to be made. The visions carried emotional resonance that suggested deep compassion for human welfare, as if some benevolent intelligence was offering assistance to mortals struggling with the complexities of existence in an uncertain world. Watson woke with a strange sensation of having received not merely information but genuine spiritual nourishment, his consciousness refreshed in ways that ordinary sleep never provided. Beside him, Holmes was already awake, his grey eyes reflecting depths of wonder that marked encounters with phenomena that expanded rather than challenged comfortable understanding of reality. "We have been granted extraordinary privilege," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying reverence for experiences that transcended ordinary investigation. "The forces operating here represent the opposite of what we confronted in Whitechapel. Where those entities sought to drain and destroy, they sought to nurture and guide. We are witnessing evidence that supernatural reality includes forces dedicated to human welfare." The following morning brought confirmation of the prophetic nature of their shared visions, as events unfolded precisely as they had witnessed during sleep. A letter arrived announcing the safe birth of a grandchild, whose difficult delivery they had seen resolved through divine intervention. News came of a business opportunity that matched exactly the prosperous venture glimpsed in their dreams. Each fulfillment strengthened their understanding that they had encountered genuine supernatural guidance. "The implications are profound," Watson observed as they prepared to return to London with knowledge that would forever change their understanding of the spiritual dimensions of reality. If benevolent supernatural forces actively seek to assist human welfare, then our work in Whitechapel represents only one aspect of a far larger reality. We must expand our understanding to encompass not merely supernatural threats, but supernatural blessings. Holmes nodded thoughtfully as their carriage carried them back toward London through landscapes that now seemed charged with infinite possibility. "We have become students of mysteries that encompass the full spectrum of supernatural manifestation," he agreed. "Our calling extends beyond merely protecting innocence from predation. We must learn to recognize and facilitate benevolent spiritual guidance when it manifests in human lives." The return to Baker Street brought them back to familiar surroundings that now seemed somehow smaller, as if their expanded understanding of reality's true dimensions made their domestic space feel constrained by comparison to the infinite possibilities they had glimpsed. Yet the comfort of home remained profound, offering anchor points of stability in a universe far more complex and wonderful than rational thought had previously dared acknowledge. "We've become pioneers," Holmes reflected as he settled into his familiar chair, with movements that carried new appreciation for simple pleasures earned through confrontation with forces both terrible and wonderful. "Our investigations are establishing precedents for understanding supernatural reality that future scholars will build upon. We are writing the first chapters of a new science that honours both reason and revelation." Watson arranged his medical implements with hands that now moved with confidence earned through successful intervention, in matters that transcended purely physical healing. "More importantly," he replied, "we have proven that human beings, properly prepared and courageously determined, can engage constructively with supernatural forces regardless of whether they manifest as threats or blessings. We have become bridges between the rational and the spiritual, between scientific understanding and ancient wisdom." The fire crackled its eternal song of warmth and safety, while outside London settled into evening rhythms that now carried associations with infinite mystery and boundless possibility. In Baker Street, two men who had faced both supernatural evil and supernatural good reflected on responsibilities that extended far beyond conventional detective work into realms where courage and wisdom could serve as instruments of divine purpose in a universe far more wonderful than they had ever dared imagine. That's our tale tonight, dear listener. Where are you drifting off from? Paris beneath a silver moon? Buenos Aires in the hush before dawn? Or Kyoto wrapped in midnight mist? If this story soothed your soul, like the episode, subscribe for more whispered journeys. Keep your thoughts gentle, your heart warm, and your dreams wide open. Until next time, sleep well wherever in the world you may be.